Hey there, it's Jeremiah. A quick message before the show. Thank you all for listening to the Neoliberal Podcast. If you'd like to support the podcast, you can do so by going to patreon.com/neoliberalproject. Patrons get access to bonus episodes that are patron exclusive, our Sticker of the Month Club, and they get access to our community Slack, where you can hang out with like-minded people and discuss politics, economics, world events, and more. Become a patron today at patreon.com/neoliberalproject, and enjoy the episode. Welcome, everyone, to another episode of the Neoliberal Podcast, part of the Progressive Policy Institute. I'm your host, Jeremiah Johnson, and today we're talking about Brazil. Joining me is Fernando Moreno, who is the head of the Brazilian chapter of the Neoliberal Project and writes at neolibres.com. Also joining us is Magno Karl, who's the executive director at Livres, which is a political organization in Brazil dedicated to working towards a liberal and free future. So, Magno and Fernando, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Jeremiah.
Thanks a lot, Jeremiah, for having us today.
So, I'm going to start out by, of course, mentioning the biggest news item in the world right now is Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And I think it's interesting to compare the situation in Ukraine in the sense that Ukraine is a very young democracy, and they've struggled with their democracy. You know, they were an authoritarian country for a long time. They were part of the Soviet Union, and even after the Soviet Union, they struggled with being corrupt. They struggled with having authoritarian governments. And only recently did they start to turn towards a more liberal, democratic future. And now they've been invaded for it. And I thought about that, and I thought about this conversation about Brazil. And I know that Brazil has its own history of struggling to maintain a democracy. So before we talk about modern Brazilian politics, can we talk about the history of Brazil? And, you know, I know Brazil has been a dictatorship at points in the past, but can you tell me if Brazil is a democracy right now, even if it's a flawed democracy, it is a democracy. How did it get to the point where it is today? What do non-Brazilians need to understand about Brazilian history?
Well, I would say that our democracy is young too. Although we've been independent from Portugal since 1822, we've been a republic since 1889. During the 20th century, we struggled basically with different sorts of dictatorship or authoritarian regimes and different arrangements of government. And, due to a very difficult access to voting or difficult access of most people to power in general, power has always been a bit far from people. Even though we had small periods of democracy during the 20th century, it wasn't even most of the 20th century. So we've had a democratic regime for 30-something years now. We had presidential elections since 1989. And of course, we've had challenges, but so far, at least, in the last 33 years, the democratic process has flowed in a sort of uninterrupted way. We've had 8 consecutive presidential elections, which is our record so far, and we haven't interrupted that flow yet. We've had challenges. 2 presidents were impeached in these 33 years. We've had, of course, and we can talk a lot about it, different threats to our democratic process, but so far, different from a lot of people argue from the left or from the right, I would say that the democratic process in Brazil remain largely intact. We have a free press, we have liberty of organization, we had relatively freedom of speech. So I would say that we've been largely unharmed in the last 30 years since we transitioned from a military dictatorship that ruled from 1964 till 1985. And so far, we've had presidents on the right, presidents on the left, presidents in the center, and things, of course, the normal debates in the political sphere, the normal debates in the public sphere, normal debates in the press. But Brazil hasn't had a very long democratic history, but in the last 33 years, we managed to keep our country open, democratic, and our political order largely free.
Yeah, I would add that Brazil history has a unfortunately long tradition of the military being involved on our politics. And this works as a counter-democratic force. Our republic was inaugurated by the military, which is already gives lots of these contradictions. We had Getúlio Vargas as a dictator in a corporativist, fascist-inspired kind of government. And we had the more recent military dictatorship. So the military are always acting as a anti-democratic force and as a political force in Brazil, and that's unfortunately very common in many places. And that's not what we see, for example, when you look for example, in the United States. In some sense, the military, of course, they have lots of power and influence, but they are not a political actor as in what we see in so many countries like Brazil.
I think that's a great point. And one of the things you said, Magno, that you've had left and right and center presidencies is very important, because one of the key ideas in democracy is the transfer of power, right? The idea that if you're defeated in an election, that you have to step aside, and that's the sign of a healthy democracy, right? And even in the United States now, it seems like we're struggling with that, where Donald Trump would rather promote conspiracy theories about how he didn't really lose. It's very frightening to think about that not happening. But it seems like Brazil, at least in the last 30 years, has had several healthy instances of one party losing power and it going very peacefully.
I would say that the exception would be more recently our current president, Bolsonaro. He has stated a couple of times that our elections are not really secure, that our ballot boxes are not really secure. We have the electronic vote, and he's been very vocal, not only against the electronic vote, but also putting some doubts on the results coming from from that system of voting, including in the election that he won. So he has, this is the first time that since 1989 that any political actor has actually put our voting system in doubt. So that kind of scares me personally, and I know scares a lot of people, because if he barely accepted the election that he won, of course, it brings the question to what would he do in case, for example, he loses his bid for re-election this year. So he not only says that the results in 2018, which is the election that he actually won, were wrong, that he actually won in the first round and not in the second, but he also said that the elections in 2014 were stolen from Aécio Neves, the candidate the center-right candidate, in favor of Dilma Rousseff, the center-left candidate. So that was actually the first time that we had this conversation. That brings us to the question, okay, would he accept the result if he were to lose the election these years? But so far, you're right. We've had peaceful transfer of power in Brazil in the last 30 years without any problem, without the military being consulted or anything like that. You know, you go to the voting station, you vote, you go home, you get the results, and that's it.
Okay, so we mentioned some big names there. Obviously, many Americans will have heard of Bolsonaro, who is the current president. But I think it's also worthwhile to just take a step back and let's paint a picture for people who are not in Brazil. Because most of our listeners, we do actually have some listeners in Brazil. And thank you very much to all of you who do listen. But most of our listeners will be outside of Brazil, mostly in the English-speaking world. And I'd love to just review who are the big actors in Brazil? Who are the most prominent politicians? Who are the most prominent parties? What are kind of the battle lines of Brazilian politics?
Well, you've asked about main parties, and Brazil has a really problem of having a lot of parties. Let's just say that. Well, I'm not in favor of two-party systems like you have in the United States. I think that's not a good system, but we are like in the other extreme case of having too many parties. I think we have more than 30 parts, right, Magno?
34.
And that's like, you know, we are talking about a lot of parties with real representation in Congress. So it's not just like you see a lot in other countries. Okay, you have like dozens of parties, but only 6 or 7 are real parties with representation. So it's okay and you have like 5, 6 parties. I think it's a good system with representation in Congress. But we have lots of parties represented in Congress. And also when we talk about like what's their ideology, what do they represent, and that's also part of the problem because okay, you have like some few small parties that are really worried about representing ideologies and have clear instance on what they do actually defend, but lots of the big parties don't have a clear ideology at all.
Well, so what are, for instance, just like the 3 or 4 biggest parties, the ones who are most likely to make like a big national impact, and what separates them, if anything?
Well, I would argue that today, for example, we have 24 parties represented in our lower chamber in the National Congress. So, for example, our House of Commons or our House of Representatives, we have 24 parties represented there. So that is complicated. I would say the most meaningful parties, it's hard to indicate because, as Fernando said, there are so many of them. So I would say we have a couple of forces. We have certainly a force on the left represented by the Workers' Party that's led by Lula, our former president, who was the Brazilian president between 2003 and 2010. And then he managed to elect his former right-hand woman, Dilma Rousseff, who was our president from 2011 until 2016. I would say we have a force on the right represented by current president Jair Bolsonaro. And we have a lot of people in the middle, a lot of parties in the middle that move between those forces, which is pretty strange to explain to anyone. If you think, well, you have a main party on the right, you have a main party on the left, and then you have a lot of parties that orbit around those two forces, depending on the balance of power. So when the Workers' Party was in power, these parties would join the Workers' Party, join the left, and act as if they have always been on the left. And now that Bolsonaro is in the power, the right is in the power, they go and join Bolsonaro as if they were always part of the right. And of course, we have other forces. For example, the Social Democratic Party, which rules the state of São Paulo, which is the second budget in Brazil, only behind the federal government, is the most populous state in the country, is ruled by the Social Democratic Party for the last 25 years. It is a political force, it's an important political force, but its candidate, the São Paulo governor, João Doria, is polling only at 5% at the moment. So it's really not, at this moment, at this point in March 2022, it's not really a relevant force in the national picture. In the national picture today, we have two main forces, Jair Bolsonaro on the right, Lula on the left. Maybe Sergio Moro, the former judge that sent Lula to prison, is polling at around 10%. But basically, we have two main forces, Jair Bolsonaro, the current president, and Lula, the former president that currently leads the polls to the election that's happening this year in October.
When you say the left and the right, in different countries that can mean different things. That can mean, should we be aggressive in our foreign policy or should we be peaceful? This could mean an economic stance about spending and taxing. This could mean a cultural stance about, what do I believe about the role of women in society and gay people and things like that. How does this break down in Brazil when we say left versus right? What really divides the Bolsonaro camp from the Workers' Party camp?
It is a pretty strange thing to explain Brazilian politics to people in other countries accustomed to some reasoning behind parties' politics, because in practice, when they are in power, they tend to get together with the balance of power is held by people who are in the middle and who have a lot of influence, for example, evangelical Christians. So they have a lot of influence independently from, if the president is on the right or in the left. So it's hard to explain in terms of, common political reasoning. But I would say mostly, in economic terms, very little differentiate Jair Bolsonaro from Lula. They are both 1970s spending politicians, 1970s big state, active state politicians. So I would say that in practical terms, despite Jair Bolsonaro's speeches and his campaigning, he campaigned on a smaller state platform, privatization platforms, but he hasn't really done much in that front. He actually has benefited a lot of interest groups that are connected to his power group, and so did Lula. It is the Brazilian political discourse it sounds a lot like the normal developed countries 1970s political discourse. Think of England in the 1970s. Both parties were big spending parties. It was we need more of state participation. We need more action from the state. Private business bad, state action good. It is the mood of the country. The country in general is a country that is socially conservative and very much has a statist approach towards the economy. So the discourse, at least, the political speech, at least, it revolves pretty much around these two points of conservative approach to society, very much influenced by the power that evangelical Christians and the evangelical churches in Brazil have, and a big spending state influenced by, of course, the correct diagnosis of Brazil being a very unequal society that requires some action towards a freer economy or a more equal society with some interventions, but everybody expects the states to sort out their own life. So we have a lot of promises of more and more state action, even if sometimes they believe it's profitable to pretend that they actually would like to make Brazil a freer country, a country that's more open to the world. Brazil today has a very, very little participation in international commerce, for example. So we look very much inwards because we inherited a lot of these interventionist policies from our previous time as a military right-wing dictatorship.
Well, Brazil is very influenced by United States. I think that applies for most of America. And much of the cultural wars, let's say, were imported, especially in the last years here in Brazil. So, for example, Magno said lots of times about the evangelical movement that comes from United States, and it got a deep root here in Brazil, which was already a very conservative society on values. Sometimes people may have a different interpretation that Brazilians are very liberal because, I don't know, maybe carnival or beaches, etc. But we have a very deep-rooted conservatism that was Catholic and now has become a lot associated with the evangelical movement. So in this group of evangelicals got deeper and deeper on the state power and political representatives, and it became a strong force of conservatism in politics, and they feel very represented now with Bolsonaro, even though we have, of course, lots of good examples of evangelicals, both leaders and followers, that reject Bolsonaro and his authoritarian and prejudice style, but it became this right-wing force. And by doing this, it kind of displaced the previous center-right force that we've already talked about. It was the Social Democratic Party, that it was very strong in the 90s. It elected Fernando Cardoso, which was the president, and got re-elected, and had a liberal agenda, both in social values and in economic terms. And they've displaced this center-right, let's say, for this very conservative and authoritarian style. But I think that's also not that weird for you in the United States to understand, because we saw something similar happening in the Republican Party, with Trump and he authoritarian grasp on the party. So I think there are some similarities as well. And Bolsonaro goes by Trump's playbook in lots of times on questioning elections, even the election that he won. I remember Trump also questioning the election he won from Hillary, which is kind of, it's funny actually. So we have some of these things that we here in Brazil, they try to bring to our reality, and sometimes it's not even very well adapted. I kind of joke, if there is some kind of controversy going on in the United States, for example, I don't know, trans people using public bathrooms, it will be some months to some conservative politician here in Brazil that starts talk about the same kind of stuff.
I apologize for that, by the way. It's the worst American import, but
we only bring the worst imports to Brazil. We have that talent since the 80s with the movies.
I think you're correct, though. I think you're correct that this is an issue not just in Brazil, but in many places, that right-wing politics seem to be more authoritarian now and more driven perhaps by personality, by kind of a tough guy, conservative personality rather than ideas. And you can see this in the United States with Trump, and perhaps with Bolsonaro. There's a big tough guy personality aspect to him. You also see it in the Philippines with Duterte, and in European parties you see Marine Le Pen in France, and there's a lot of examples. But But I guess my next question, one thing I'm always curious about, because we've done this episode many times. We've done this with Taiwan, with Catalonia, with Chile. I'm always curious how the word liberal plays in specific countries. Do people in Brazil call themselves liberals at all, or not? And how do people understand that word liberal? If you said this idea is very liberal or this person is liberal, what would that mean to a Brazilian?
To an educated Brazilian, it would mean the classical meaning of the word, the word as it is represented or understood in Europe, not the liberal that we know it's used, for example, in the United States. People would associate that with, a free market politics and tolerant, free society in Brazil. So I would say that here we have the classical understanding of it, although for a long, long time, the word would only be used in the political context in a way to call your adversaries. So nobody would call themselves liberal. They would call their adversaries, their enemies, liberal. It was only a swear word. Pretty much like neoliberal here too. I went to university in the early 2000s, and that word and that term would only exist for your opponents. No one would ever call themselves liberal or neoliberal. But that has changed because there was then a new generation coming up, first in society, a new generation saying, hey, we are actually liberals, and that's what we stand for. Let me clarify what we stand for, and this is what we believe. And that started very small, but today, 10, 15 years later, we can say that out of 513 members of the lower chamber of parliament, we probably have about 25, 30 that would say, I am a liberal, and this is who I am, this is what I believe, and that's fine. That may sound trivial to most people who are listening to us around the world, but that's a massive step here in Brazil because, we ended the second term of Fernando Henrique Cardoso. As Fernando had mentioned, he was the president between 95 and 2002. And he was from the Social Democratic Party, but never tried to connect the names of the political parties in Brazil to their actual policies. So the Social Democratic Party is a center-right party. The most right-wing party in Brazil is called the Progressive Party. So don't forget about it. And Bolsonaro's party, of course, is the Liberal Party. And he's not one of us, of course.
So I just have to ask. I want to make sure I keep it straight in my head. The Progressive Party is very right wing. The Liberal Party is nationalist right wing.
Yeah.
And the Social Democratic Party is center
right. Yeah. And then you have a bunch of socialists, communists, freedom and liberty, workers. We have plenty of names because we have 34 registered parties in Brazil. But let me just take a step back so everyone can understand a little better. Up from 1964 until 1982, Brazil had a two-party system imposed by the dictatorship. Actually, it was from 68. In 68, the military government extinguished closed all the parties and then determined that we should have only two parties, one on the right and one in opposition to the right party. So the right party was the system party, the dictatorship party. And at the end of the dictatorship, that right-wing party, the one that supported the dictatorship, went through different names, but today that party, that right-wing military dictatorship, closing political parties and putting your opposition in prison is called the Progressive Party. The Liberal Party is a descendant of that party and is also on the right, nationalist, anti-capitalism, I would say, because they don't really like business, they don't really like the market, they don't really like what we, for in a more traditional way, would see the normal center of right of the center parties. They are really big spending, big government, right-wing party, populist parties, and this is the Liberal Party, which Bolsonaro belongs to right now. So it's very confusing, the political spectrum in Brazil. But if you don't think too much about the party's names, you can actually start understanding that, well, the current government is on the right, is a nationalist, populist, anti-free market right wing. And on the left, we have the normal left wing, South American, Latin American, I would say, populist left wing parties.
Jeremiah, I really liked the TV show that was called Whose Line Is It Anyway? So to misquote it, I would say that in Brazil, our political parties, everything's made up and the names don't matter.
Oh, man. Well, let's get away from just talking about these abstract ideas, because we've been talking a lot about history and ideas and what are the names, what are the ideologies. But let's talk about real issues. So in Brazilian politics, what are currently the biggest issues that are being fought over? If the election was tomorrow, what would the voters care about the most? What are the things that need to be fixed or that the voters have in their mind that politicians are talking about all the time? What are those issues that are really important in Brazilian politics?
Well, I would go first and say if the election were tomorrow, we'd totally be talking about fuel prices. Fuel prices have skyrocketed here in Brazil. I think normal petrol has gone up 30% in the last year or so. Brazil is heavily dependent on road transportation, so trucks move our stuff around. They are the transportation that takes food to supermarkets. We depend heavily on oil-based fuel, so that's a number one worry. Today, Congress is discussing a way to control prices or try to bring prices down without interfering so much in the market. And certainly corruption, because we have a former president that spent 2 years in prison for corruption. We have the judge who sent him to prison, who now is a politician and is also running for president. So I would say those two issues, fuel prices, corruption, and of course, we've been through a long economic crisis for the last almost 10 years, I would say. We've been in recession a couple of times. Unemployment has gone up. The pandemic didn't help. We were already in crisis, and then the pandemic came on top of it. Things like that happened. Probably people will mention a lot what the government has done, or better, has not done during the pandemic. Bolsonaro was one of the standard bearers of the denialism around the world. He didn't believe that the pandemic was serious. Then he didn't believe that the vaccination was effective. So I'm sure these issues will come back too. I would say that in summary, fuel prices, economic recession, and the government response to the pandemic.
Fernando, anything you would add there on top of economic growth, corruption, and fuel?
Yeah, well, if you look at the main contenders for this election, you have Lula. He'll probably win the elections if the polls are correct. We'll see. And he'll probably talk a lot about unemployment and misery. there is lots of hunger here in Brazil and lots of unemployment. And he'll try to compare with when he was president. He really had a good economic growth. Of course, he was also favored by the boom in commodities. He'll probably have a tougher time if he gets elected. But he'll obviously try to compare with his first he was elected and re-elected, so he'll compare with when he was president. Bolsonaro, you have a hard time trying to show what he actually did for the economy or anything else. He has a very poor record on doing actually, getting stuff done, politics approved, and so on. So I will guess he'll try again the conservative cards on social issues. He has this strong army of people doing on WhatsApp and Facebook and so on, try to talk bad about the left and the LGBT groups and so on, feminists. So he'll probably go with these conservative cards. But I don't know if he'll have the same success since he now is president. He should have more to show on what he actually was able to do. Well, we have Sergio Moro, which will talk a lot about corruption. He'll try to sell himself as the guy who put Lula in jail for corruption, and also he was part of Bolsonaro government, but he parted away from Bolsonaro, and he'll say maybe, I don't know, that he'll try putting both of them on jail and combat corruption from both sides. Well, we have also Ciro Gomes, which is another left. He's also trying to make his case also by the left, but I think he'll have a hard time taking Lula's votes. He'll try actually to present himself as another face from the left that is tired from Lula and what the Workers' Party do in the left, like trying to monopolize it. And we have Doria. He's the governor of the main state here in Brazil, from São Paulo, and he'll probably try to sell a lot of the idea that he was the one responsible for bringing the vaccines here to Brazil, which he kind of has a point, since Bolsonaro was ignoring the calls from Pfizer to sell the vaccines here in Brazil, and only after João Doria started bringing the vaccines from China, from Sinovac, Coronavac, only after he started applying those vaccines here in São Paulo that Bolsonaro actually said, oh, let's buy these vaccines from Pfizer. It was part of the scandals that were investigated here by the Senate on why it took so long to start vaccination here in Brazil. So I think that's what the main contenders will try to sell their case, and we'll see.
I guess my next question is then, we've talked about some of the main issues in Brazilian politics being corruption, economic growth in general, just there's a lot of poverty. Brazil is still kind of a developing nation. It's not a very, very poor country, but it's not a very rich country either. It's in the middle. And so there's corruption, economics, fuel prices. What are the liberal solutions to these problems? Because, it seems like neither Lula nor Bolsonaro are liberals. Neither of them are really very liberal. What would a liberal do to address these problems in Brazil? How would a liberal leader fix some of this?
I would say the Brazilian state has a lot to improve. To start with, there is a lot of rules that we decided in our constitution, that are either not very well implemented or are implemented in a distorted way that challenges or channels resources to those best connected politically and less resources for those who need the resources the most. Brazil case is not only that for our intentions, our good intentions, I would say, we are still too poor to provide for so many people with good intentions, but we're still poor to provide for all of them, is that we act in a way that it's not very well thought, it's not very well directed, it's not focused on those who need help the most. We've had some successes, and I believe those successes should inspire us. Perhaps the most successful economic policy in Brazil was thought of and enacted by liberal thinkers. It was the plan to change our currency, to reform our currency, to switch to our current currency, which is called reais, done in July 1994. Brazil had suffered with very, very high inflation in the thousands per year for a long time. As a child, I remember prices changing every day and sometimes changing during a day. You would get your monthly salary and you would spend in the same day because tomorrow it would be worth a little less. And it was the work of liberal thinkers. One of them is a member of the board of my organization that made things change. Then Brazil was free from inflation. Brazil has also a very successful plan against poverty called Bolsa Família. It's a direct transfer of resources. It was also from liberal minds that said, okay, we have a budget to fight poverty, right? Right. So instead of sending this money to the governor that then will buy a lot of things and then send to a mayor that will then distribute those things to people, let's just send money to people and let them buy their own stuff. And this was enacted by a center-left government. It was enacted by Lula's government. So I think the debate here is still in a very early stage. In some societies, you would say, okay, we need to cut government spending here to become more efficient or to stimulate that area of the economy or that sector or this sector. Brazil would already benefit a lot by just thinking better about how to spend money and where money is going. The government operates in the economy by subsidizing things, by favoring some sectors. If we just put, as we say in Brazil, we make a lot of soccer analogies here. If we just put the ball on the ground, if we just take a look at our processes and think, what can we do that's better, more efficient, more focused, I think we would do already a lot better. And actually, there is a lot of small things that you can do, especially for the Brazilians who, our market, our formal work market is very, very small compared to the size of the population. So if we try to make the rules easier for people to start their own company, Brazilians are very creative. We are used to dealing with a very inefficient state from which we expect a lot, but actually delivers very little. So if we can organize processes, economic processes, the institutions to make those things, the creativity of these people, of this country that got used to fighting with their own hands for survival, we could generate a lot of income for people. But everything is hard, everything is bureaucratic. We tend to favor those who are better connected. So, if you are a small company, you have no say in politics, you have no say in the economic decisions. I think there is a lot to be gained in Brazil by taking a look at the processes as things are done and making them better. Then later on, we can talk about taxes. The tax burden in Brazil is very high if you think of countries that have our level of income. But the complex legislation, the complex processes, inefficient bureaucracy, a state that cannot offer basic services for Brazilian, a state that pushes people out of its own system, that pushes people into the gray economy, cannot be successfully organized. So I think a main political platform for liberals as a national platform in Brazil would just take a look in our processes, in all the subsidies we spread around, all the investments we spread around, and think, how can we make it more rational? How can we focus them more on those who actually need them? And then how can we make life for people easier for them to just conduct their business, be it their own business, their own ideas of what they can buy or sell, or their creativity, somebody they can hire, something. How can we make life easier for Brazilians? I think we spend a lot of time, particularly politicians, spend a lot of time thinking of the health of the state. And it's easier to understand why we did it for a long time, because for a long time, Brazil had a state that was badly organized. We barely had a budget in the 90s. So it's easy to understand why we think of the health of the state a lot. But I guess a basic liberal platform, in one line, I would say, let's focus a bit on the health of the society. How can we make society more prosperous? How can we make the state interventions, since they will exist anyway, how can we make them more efficient and a little more focused on those who need it the most?
I think Magno covered the main points. I would add we should invest more in education. Of course, here the priorities are also messed up. So we spend a lot in public universities that are usually attended by an elite, and we invest comparatively low in primary education, for example. So we always have this problem with priorities, and the poorest are always very underrepresented. And I think that we could go from, it's important to think on education when you are liberals. Through education, you have better citizens that will be able to demand more from the state, from the politicians, don't accept the things like selling votes. It's still a problem in many parts of Brazil. I would also add we should have less state enterprise. We have companies run by the state. Okay, we can think on a case for having the state having some enterprise on strategical matters and so on, but we definitely have lots of them. Some got privatized in the 90s, but still there are many that are running things around here, and they have all kinds of inefficiencies, and we should try privatizing them as well. But of course, it's politically hard to privatize them. Bolsonaro Liberal Ministry of Economics, he promised that he would privatize lots of state companies here in Brazil. He actually said that he would make 1 trillion reais on privatization, which is laughable. And they not only did not privatize anything at all, but they also created some new state enterprises, for example. So it is shows out this is shows that it's hard to mess with current represented interests on one hand, but also it's very symbolic on how incompetent was Bolsonaro these 4 years of Bolsonaro's presidency.
One question I have about a place like Brazil is a political question, and I think it's the strategy that liberals should use. I can imagine two ideas for liberals in Brazil. One of the ideas being that, Brazil has a lot of parties. We should create a liberal party or support a liberal political party and simply try to make change happen through a liberal political party, and not the Liberal Party, which apparently is a nationalist party, but an actually liberal party. But another idea would be to try to use the existing parties, the Workers' Party or the Progressive Party, and make those parties more liberal from the inside, to join, the Lula administration and try to influence them to be better politicians, because right now it seems like they are the powerful force. Which strategy do you think is more useful, is better for liberal Brazilians, to try to create their own parties or to try to work within the big powerful parties?
I think that's a great opportunity to Magno talk a little more about Livres, because they tried exactly what you've just mentioned.
Yeah, we started as a liberal faction inside a party, the Social Liberal Party. We were invited to join this party. People said, well, we want to change this party. We wanted to tilt this party more in a liberal direction. And you guys are young and liberal, and we believe you guys are capable. So why don't you guys join us? You can join us in the communications department. We're gonna let you lead the communications department, and we're gonna let you lead the foundation of the party. The foundation of parties in Brazil, they are created by law, so every party should have a foundation, and it's supposedly the formation, the educational wing of parties. So we joined it in 2016, and we made a good effort. We transformed the party. The party was very small, and we gained a lot of members. I believe in 2017, we were the party that gained most members, or more members than any other party in Brazil. But then in January 2018, when we already controlled 13 out of 27 states, 13 cells of the party out of 27 states. In January 2018, we were surprised by the president of our party meeting with Jair Bolsonaro. And we thought, wait, is there anything going here? And the president said, no, he's just visiting and we're just talking. We said, okay. Then a couple of days later, it was announced that Bolsonaro, an illiberal nationalist, misogynistic, homophobic politician, was joining our party. So, of course, we quit the party immediately, and we became an independent political movement. And what that means is that we got out of the party with a lot of people who wanted to engage in political parties, in political activities, and we stimulated them to join other parties. Brazil is very large, and the political parties are not only not very ideological, but they are also very fragmented. So depending on the state, depending on the person who controls that party in that state, the party can have an inclination more to the right, more to the left, more liberal, more illiberal. So we left people free to join any party they wanted, of course, within the acceptable principles of democracy. And then they continue to be connected to us. And what we do is that we support those people who want to run for office, who wants to join political parties, we support them with ideas, with suggestions, with material that can help their political activities in their own parties. Whatever parties they want to be part of, they can always count on us, on Livres, to carry on their own activities. And today we set up as an association. So we have this association today has about 4,500 members, 4,600 members. Out of them, we have 42 that hold today political offices that were elected. We have 10 in the federal level, we have 15 in the state levels, we have the rest in the city councils. So in some level, we didn't choose between any of those alternatives that you put to us, Jeremiah. We actually did both of them at the same time. We not only join parties that are actually liberal, we not only work with parties who are actually liberal, but we work too with parties that are kind of liberal, or parties that are liberal only in this matter that we're talking today. I don't know, be it medical marijuana, for example. We work very well with the left when we talk about the economy, privatization, pensions reform. We work very well with parties that are on the right. So we are liberals. We have strong principles, but in our action, in our political action, we try to be pragmatic and say, whoever wants to collaborate with us in this topic, we are game, we are up for it. And whoever wants to run for office and need a platform, need ideas, here we have them. And we have ideas, we have some technical work that we send to members of politicians' staffs, we send to politicians themselves, and these material make the round. So people read our material, get arguments from our material, and sometimes we see them defending their point using the words we wrote, which is very pleasant. So in a way, in these last 4 years, Livres reinvented itself from a project of a political party to a movement centered on liberal values that intends to influence politics and politicians.
I think that's a really, really interesting way that Livres is set up, and I'm really fascinated to see just how it continues to go in the future. But we are coming up on time, so I'll ask the traditional final question on this show, which is, what should people do if they want to learn more? If they're interested in learning more about Brazilian politics, or about the history of Brazil, or about the issues, and just following the news that's coming out of Brazil, what would you recommend that Americans or Europeans should read or do? And this could be books to understand Brazil, or just people to follow on Twitter, which publications are the best, anything that you think would help people understand Brazilian politics.
Brazilian politics, it's complicated. It's hard to understand if you're not, if you don't read Portuguese, if you're not connected to anyone here. I would say the Economist, for example, has a pretty good coverage of Brazilian politics, mostly Brazilian economics. But it's hard. I think the coverage of Brazil the international coverage of Brazil got very polluted once Bolsonaro took office, because he's such a pariah, he's such an awful person, he's such a horrible politician, that it got harder to understand the real issues of Brazil, because everything is looked through the lenses of a very unpopular government with erratic problems or policies, and a guy who represents everything that anyone who holds any liberal values should despise. But I would say if you read Portuguese, the Brazilian press is still pretty good, given the stress it goes through and given the honestly the center of the left bias it has. But for those who don't read Portuguese, I would say the Economist provides a very good. It actually has somebody living in São Paulo who reports from here, and most of the time he provides a very, very good coverage of politics, economics, and society over here in Brazil.
Well, I will recommend that you also follow what we from neoliberals here in Brazil are writing about Brazil. You can read more on neoliberalize.com. Of course, you can always use Google Translate to help understand what we are talking in our articles in Portuguese. From a neoliberal perspective, it's a good resource. Sometimes you're not posting that often, but we have some interesting articles there. And we also are now publishing some of them on neoliberal Reddit, so we can easily access those articles. And I think Livres also has some interesting publications on their website as well, right, Magno?
Yeah, but only in Portuguese for now, unfortunately. But we do have a lot of publications there. We have a lot of we are very active on social media, and for those who can get there are some resources, right? You can translate that automatically. You can translate that on Google Translate. On Twitter, you can totally translate. Instagram, I guess you can translate that too. Our handle is Eu Sou Livres, EUSOULIVRES.
And we will provide links in the show notes to neoliberes.com and the Livres website and the social handles as well. And I would echo, I've read things on neoliberes.com. It's quite good. Google Translate works very, very well for Portuguese to English. So I would encourage everyone to go check it out. In the meantime, I have to say thank you to Magno and Fernando. Thank you so much for coming on the show.
Oh, thank you for the invitation. I'm a listener, and this is actually quite surreal to be part of a podcast that I'm used to listening to. So thanks a lot for the invitation, Jeremiah. Thank you, Fernando. Thank you guys for the work you guys keep doing. I'm a follower. I'm an enthusiastic follower, and I listen to the podcast very often. So it's a pleasure to be part of it now.